In 1381, a simple farmer from Kent, England stood face to face with the King of England. No royal blood, no army training, no title, no power. Just a man who had watched his people suffer long enough and decided that someone had to do something about it. Behind him stood 30,000 people who had marched from across England to stand with him. In front of him stood a 14-year-old king who controlled the most powerful military in Europe. For one extraordinary moment, the farmer was winning. What happened next is one of the most remarkable and most heartbreaking true stories in all of English history. And in September 2026, Hollywood is releasing a major film about it, starring Andrew Garfield. But the real story is more powerful than anything in the movie. This is the true story of Wat Tyler, the man who almost changed everything. To understand Wat Tyler, you first need to understand what England looked like in the years before 1381. 20 years earlier, in 1348, the Black Death had arrived, a plague so devastating that it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire English population. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields that had been farmed for generations sat empty. There were simply not enough people left to work the land. This created something unexpected. For the first time in English history, the poor had power. Not political power, but economic power. Landowners needed workers desperately. Workers could demand better wages. Peasants who had spent generations tied to the land, owned essentially like property by the lords above them, suddenly found that they had some negotiating room. For a brief moment, life was getting slightly less terrible for ordinary English people. Then the government stepped in. Laws were passed to fix peasant wages at pre-plague levels, meaning the poor were legally forbidden from earning the better wages the labor shortage should have given them. And then came the wars. England was fighting France in the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had been dragging on for decades and was going badly. Wars cost money, and the government needed money fast. The solution they chose was a poll tax. Not a tax based on how much you earn. A flat tax, 1 shilling from every single person in England over the age of 15. Whether you were a wealthy nobleman or a starving peasant, you owed the same amount. 1 shilling was not a small sum for a poor family. For many people, it represented days or weeks of wages. This was the third poll tax in 4 years, and England was done. In May 1381, a tax collector arrived in the Essex village of Fobbing. He was there to find out why the villagers had not paid their poll tax. The people of Fobbing had a simple answer. They threw him out. When King Richard II sent soldiers to restore order, the villagers threw them out too. Word spread fast across Kent and Essex. Something was happening. People who had been suffering in silence for years suddenly realized they were not alone. The rebellion spread from village to village like fire through dry grass. And then came the moment that turned a protest into a revolution. A tax collector arrived at the home of a man named Wat Tyler in Kent. The exact details of what happened next vary depending on which account you read, but the core of the story is this. The tax collector attempted to verify whether Tyler's teenage daughter was old enough to pay the tax. What he did went beyond checking her age. He assaulted her. Tyler came home to find what had happened. He killed the tax collector on the spot. In that moment, Wat Tyler went from being a farmer who was angry about taxes to being a man with nothing left to lose. And the people of Kent rallied around him immediately. They elected him their leader. Not because he was the most educated, not because he had military experience, because he had done what every one of them had wanted to do for years and had been too afraid to. He had stood up. What happened next stunned the English government completely. Tyler organized the rebels of Kent into a marching army. At the same time, rebels from Essex were doing the same thing. Letters were sent back and forth between the groups, coordinating tactics, sharing information, building a movement that the government had no idea how to handle. By June 1381, somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people were converging on London from multiple directions. Farmers, craftsmen, village officials, even some lower clergy. People who had never held a weapon in their lives were marching on the most powerful city in England. As the rebels gathered at Blackheath outside London, a priest named John Bull gave a sermon that became one of the most famous speeches of the medieval period. He asked a simple question that cut through everything. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? In simple words, when the world began and everyone worked with their hands, where did the idea come from that some people were worth more than others? The crowd roared. Tyler then addressed his army with words that were recorded by historians of the time. "We come not as thieves and robbers. We come seeking social justice." On June 13th, the rebels entered London. The city itself was largely sympathetic. Many Londoners opened the gates for them. The rebels attacked specific targets: the homes of government ministers, legal records that documented their bondage, the palace of the king's uncle John of Gaunt, who was deeply unpopular. They burned documents. They opened prisons. They executed several officials they held responsible for the poll tax. The government was paralyzed. There were only a few hundred soldiers in London. The city was essentially defenseless, and a 14-year-old king was about to have to deal with this entirely on his own. On June 14, 1381, King Richard II rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. He was 14 years old. Whatever else history says about Richard II, and history has plenty to say, what he did that day took courage. He rode out personally to face tens of thousands of angry rebels when his advisors were hiding behind walls. Wat Tyler presented the demands of the peasants directly to the king. The poll tax to be abolished forever, an end to serfdom, the system that tied peasants to the land and treated them as property, free pardons for everyone involved in the rebellion, the removal of corrupt government officials. Richard agreed to everything. Clerks were immediately set to work, writing out charters, official documents, giving the peasants their freedom. Most of the rebels, satisfied that the king had given his word, began to leave London and head home. But Wat Tyler did not trust it. He was smarter than that. He had watched the powerful make promises to the poor his entire life. He knew exactly how much those promises were worth once the powerful felt safe again. He and John Ball kept their followers in London. The next day, June 15th, Tyler met with the king again at Smithfield, just outside London. The meeting at Smithfield started as a negotiation. Tyler rode forward to speak with the king directly, something almost unheard of, a commoner addressing a monarch face to face as an equal. He put forward even more demands: an end to all church privileges, equal rights under the law for all men, freedom for every serf in England. Then something happened that historians still debate. Accounts differ on exactly what triggered it. Some say Tyler made a gesture that was interpreted as threatening. Some say he spoke disrespectfully to the king. Some say the whole thing was planned in advance by the king's men. What is certain is that William Walworth, the mayor of London, rode forward and stabbed Wat Tyler. Tyler managed to ride a short distance before falling from his horse. His army watched in silence as their leader fell. For a moment, the entire situation hung on a knife's edge. 30,000 armed rebels stood watching the man who had led them here dying on the ground. Then 14-year-old Richard II did something extraordinary. He rode forward alone toward the rebel army, directly toward them, without guards, without soldiers, and he spoke. "You shall have no captain but me." He promised the rebels that their demands would be met, that he would be their king and their leader, that everything Tyler had fought for would be honored. The rebels, stunned, leaderless, and looking at a teenager riding alone toward them with nothing but his word, believed him. They went home. It was the moment that ended the Peasants Revolt, and Richard II had no intention of keeping a single promise he had made. Within weeks of the rebellion ending, Richard II issued a statement that made his position clear. "Villains ye are still, and villains ye shall remain." The promises made at Mile End and Smithfield were declared invalid, given under duress, therefore not legally binding. The leaders of the rebellion were hunted down. John Ball was captured, tried, and executed. Hundreds of rebels were hanged across England. Wat Tyler was already dead, stabbed during what was supposed to be a negotiation. His head was placed on London Bridge as a warning. The poll tax was repealed. That much was kept. No English government collected a poll tax again for 600 years until 1990, when Margaret Thatcher tried it, sparked massive riots across Britain, and was eventually forced to abandon it. Some lessons take a very long time to learn. The feudal system that Tyler had fought to end did not collapse that summer, but the Black Death had already done its slow work. Over the following century, the labor shortage continued. Lords who needed workers had to offer better conditions. By the early 1500s, serfdom in England had essentially disappeared, not because of a law, not because of a decree, but because the economics no longer supported it. Wat Tyler did not live to see it. But the farmer from Kent who stood face to face with the king and demanded to be treated as a human being was not entirely wrong about which way history was going. He was just a few decades too early.